Good evening, this is Gareth Kavanagh with Gript. I'm here today with Koen Stoop, the EU Policy Coordinator of the World Uyghur Congress. Koen, it's great to have you here today.
Thank you much, Gary. It's good to be here.
Koen, could you just start off by giving a bit of an explanation of what the World Uyghur Congress does at the minute, who the Uyghur people are, and sort of why we've started to see more and more of them in the news over the last year?
Of course. So the World Uyghur Congress is an international umbrella organization that represents the collective interest of the Uyghur people, both in the Uyghur region and abroad. So to just go back one step, the Uyghur people are a Turkic ethnic group who are originally from Central and East Asia, but are native to what the Uyghurs call East Turkestan, but what is now officially known in China as the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And what the World Uyghur Congress does since it was established in 2004 is that it promotes and advocates for the human rights of the Uyghur people. So the situation of the Uyghurs who are, as I said, native to what the Uyghurs call East Turkestan, or what I will also call the Uyghur region. The Uyghurs have been always in and out of the Chinese Empire for the past centuries. But since the early 20th century, it has become officially part of China, of the country China, since it was invaded by the People's Liberation Army. And basically, fast forward to the 21st century, basically since Xi Jinping became the president of China, the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, we have seen a lot of repression towards the Uyghur people, taken together being an attack on the very distinct ethnic identity of the Uyghur people. So not only attacking their culture, but also their religion, their language, and also the people themselves, as I will later also explain. And as I said, the World Uyghur Congress promotes the human rights of the Uyghur people in front of various international institutions like the European Union, the United Nations, but also in countries like the United States, the UK, and a host of different European countries.
So I'm sure people would have seen images of people with shaved heads being tied to the ground, waiting for trains. We've heard stories of forced labor, mass detention camps. What's actually happening on the ground in the region? Are those reports accurate, or?
Yes. So as you see, as you say, like the images of what detainees with shaven heads are, of course, the images that come out and that get picked up the most. But this is actually part of, as I said, a larger campaign to target the very ethnic identity of the Uyghurs, and as a result, also the Uyghur peoples themselves. So as I said before, since President Xi Jinping took the lead, became leader in China, the situation worsens gradually. But especially since 2017, a lot of Uyghurs in the diaspora started losing contact with their family members. Their families didn't reach out to them anymore, and the people in the diaspora couldn't reach the people in East Turkestan. So soon after, reports started emerging that the Chinese authorities started building what turned out to be a very expensive internment camp system, where we estimate that now between 1.8 and 3 million Uyghurs are being arbitrarily detained. And these images emerging from these camps, also satellite imagery, has caught the eye of the world. And indeed, as you say, especially in 2020, reports have started coming out that this internment camp system is also now linked to a pervasive scheme of forced labor. So where Uyghurs are not only forced to work inside these camps, but these camps are also transmitted into forced labor camps. And also recently, new evidence has come out that throughout the Uyghur region as a whole, Uyghurs have been forced to pick cotton, for instance, and do other forms of forced labor.
So I have heard some reports that say there are indications that they're moving away from the camp systems and moving more towards more permanent detainment facilities or just a wider spread of forced labor. Is that accurate from what you've seen, or are the camps still a very integral part of what's happening on the ground?
I would say that's both correct. So first of all, I think it's good to say that for the first years of the satellite imagery coming out and the existence of the camp being reported by various news outlets, the Chinese government initially denied the existence of these camps. Based on the satellite imagery, the Chinese government eventually conceded, but it has always said they are certain re-education camps. And indeed, over the past year, the Chinese government has said that Uyghurs and also other Turkic Muslims being detained in these camps have what they called graduated. However, new reports have emerged over the course of last year that, in fact, the internment camp system is actually expanding, meaning that detainment facilities are being upgraded or expanded. And this connects also to the system of Uyghur forced labor. So yes, the internment system continues to be an integral part of the Chinese government's policy of repression, but we also see now that Uyghurs, not only from these internment camps, but Uyghurs from the Uyghur region as a whole, are now being forced into forced labor settings on a massive scale, really.
So the Chinese are saying these are educational camps, that they're there to combat extremism and give people the skills to integrate into China. What are conditions like in the camps?
Conditions from what we are able to hear, of course, because first of all, to get an insight in what is actually happening inside these camps is extremely difficult, because China does not let any independent observers into these camps. And the observers that have been allowed to enter these camps, they were mostly foreign journalists, have been painted a picture by the Chinese Communist Party that Uyghurs are very happy, are being taught classes that they are willingly attending. But in reality, from camp survivors, we've heard the most harrowing stories of severe maltreatment. So this includes torture, as we have said, forced labor, sexual abuse, and also that women, for instance, are subjected to forced sterilizations. From what we've heard is that Uyghurs have described being in overcrowded prison cells. They are watched 24/7. And yes, I said it's a case of severe maltreatment, and the conditions in the camps, as we hear from camp survivors, are really horrible.
So we're talking there about forced labor. Do we have any idea what kind of firms this labor is being used in? Have any Western companies been connected directly to the use of this forced labor?
Yes. So in the beginning of 2020, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute published a report which is based on publicly available documents from the Chinese Communist Party detailing how tens of thousands of Uyghurs have been moved into forced labor settings throughout China. So this is not only a case of where Uyghurs inside the Uyghur region are being subjected to forced labor, but are also transferred to factories throughout China. And one of the major findings of this report was that it connected over 80 Western apparel brands to the cotton or other production of clothing inside these factories. And since then, from the evidence that's been coming out, I think it is safe to say that like all cotton being produced in East Turkestan is most probably tainted by Uyghur forced labor. And this has very significant consequences for the Western world as well, as over 20% of the world's cotton production is from the Uyghur region. So that gives you kind of a picture, that paints a picture of the extensive scale of Uyghur forced labor and how it implies basically the entire fashion industry, the global fashion industry.
So when did this start to happen? Because stories have started popping up maybe the last year and a half, slightly longer than that. But in many ways, this seems quite similar to what happened to the Falun Gong, more with the detentions, and obviously it was a very different situation. But are these two things connected, as in that they flow into each other, or was the Falun Gong persecution happened earlier, there was a stoppage, and then it went into this, or was it just one kind of process?
Mm-hmm. So the Uyghur crisis is definitely not an isolated case. We see this happening throughout China, though in different forms and in different ways of severity. For instance, we have similar grave human rights violations happening against Tibetans, people in South Mongolia, and most recently we've also seen this happening, though in a different way, in Hong Kong. So the way this can be understood is that what is happening to all these, a lot of them are ethnic minority groups, for instance, Tibetans, Uyghurs as well, and Falun Gong on a more religious level. They've all been targeted as having a distinct ethnic, cultural, religious identity. And this goes against Xi Jinping's aim to have a unified China, which is based on the Han Chinese culture. So in the end, what all these current policies against these different groups are trying to aim for is a very monocultural China, in which there are no different religious, cultural, linguistic expressions. So what is happening now to the Uyghurs neatly links into these different cases. I can, for instance, single out the person of Cheng Guangguo, who was first responsible in Tibet for repressive policies there, and since 2016 was moved to East Turkestan to become a leading figure there. And since then, Cheng Guangguo has really implemented a police state of mass surveillance. So we see that not only in terms of policies, these are applied to different groups in China, but it's also is concretely connected to certain individuals.
So you said there about Xi Jinping and his attempts to build this monocultural China based on the Han. Why is that happening? And I mean, we've heard him come out and say that this is being done in order to combat extremism, and it's, that is the only reason that's being done. But I think we can see, not just in relation to Uyghurs, but in relation to other ethnic minorities in the country, that there does seem to be a movement against quite a lot of them. But what is the purpose behind that? Why are they trying to build this monocultural state?
I would say there's not one particular reason that could be singled out as being the underlying reason to all of this. If we talk about the Uyghurs and also East Turkestan, one of the major reasons is also its geographical location. The Uyghur region has always played a very important part in the ancient Silk Road, connecting China to Central Asia, and in the end also to Europe. And Xi Jinping, one of his main projects is the Belt and Road Initiative, that is basically connecting, again, China through railways to Europe. And East Turkestan is geographically a very important region. So in this sense, this is only one of the many reasons that can be singled out, but in this geographical, but most of all, like economic sense, it is imperative for the Chinese Communist Party to have absolute control over the region, as not to disturb its Belt and Road Initiative. And in the end, it all boils down to state control over the Uyghur people, over Tibetans and people in Hong Kong. And as you say, the Chinese Communist Party has defended its repressive policies against Uyghurs as being a counter terrorist measure. However, we see that this is only a rhetoric that was adopted after the terrorist attacks in the US in 2001. And really, after 2001, the Chinese Communist Party really started to adopt this language to defend its policies against Uyghurs. And this has escalated so much that right now, reasons for being sent to the camp are like having a long beard, possessing a Quran, having family abroad, talking to family abroad. Like these have all become reasons to be arbitrarily detained for Uyghurs in these internment camps. And these are also like very everyday non-violent expressions, whether they be cultural, linguistic, or religious. These have all been incorporated in these anti-terrorism measures of the Chinese Communist Party. So we really see that in the end, it's all about state control, and not allowing any form of dissent or any form of distinct cultural religious expression, whether it be by Uyghurs or also by Tibetans, people in southern Mongolia, and so on.
So your expectation would be that there will be no let up here, that this is a project that's going to be carried out pretty much to the end, or until the Chinese government is satisfied that there's absolutely no resistance left on the ground.
Indeed, it was even reiterated by President Xi Jinping a few months back in his speech, that the Chinese Communist Party said that their policies in East Turkestan were going well and that they would continue doing so. So I think that also highlights the need for the international community to take action, and I think that's also why it's a good thing that this is being picked up more and more. But this is also, I would say, logical given the scale and the severity of the situation.
So we've seen more and more academics come out and say that what is happening on the ground meets the strict legal definition of genocide. And maybe last year there were people saying it could be considered a cultural genocide, but now I think, particularly with the reports of mass sterilization that have started to come out, there seems to be much more movement to simply say this is actually just a cut and dry, legally defined genocide. And what is your opinion on that? Do you think what is happening here meets that definition?
I think overall, like myself and also the World Uyghur Congress has also been very careful about the language that we use when referring to crisis, because like using the right language also means calling for appropriate action to be taken. And as you say, like indeed, we've mentioned before that it indeed could be or is a cultural genocide, given the widespread reports of the destruction of mosques and also a lot of forms of cultural heritage. But as you rightly mentioned, in July, the German scholar Adrian Zenz, he released a report in which he detailed how the Chinese authorities have implemented a scheme of forced abortion and forced sterilization in order to suppress Uyghur birth rates. And I think especially these findings, they meet one of the criteria of genocide under the UN Genocide Convention. So since then, we do consider this to be a genocide. However, calling for something to be a genocide as a civil society organization only has the appropriate effect if this is also be taken up by the international community and by the necessary international actors. So we've seen it's been taken up in Canada, where the Committee on Human Rights, based on multiple hearings, has indeed said, yes, this constitutes a genocide. There is a resolution in the United States that really calls upon the Secretary of State to really determine whether these atrocities against Uyghurs indeed constitute a genocide. Like the debate is now in England and in the UK as well. But so far, especially in the European Union, we've seen that many countries are reluctant to call something a genocide because it's, of course, the gravest crime that can be committed, and therefore also necessitates the appropriate response from these countries. And it's therefore also that the World Uyghur Congress earlier this year, or in 2020 in September, has called for the establishment of a tribunal, which was indeed established the month after, called the Uyghur Tribunal. And the aim of this Uyghur Tribunal is to collect all the evidence. It will, as part of this tribunal, an independent team of legal experts will then look at this evidence, hold hearings over the course of 2021, and hopefully by the end of this year, it will come with an independent legal judgment to see whether this is indeed a genocide or not. And these, as you say, legal, like strictly legal judgments, according to a very strict legal definition, are very important, because the European Union, in our meetings with European Union, they've always said, yes, we cannot make a genocide designation on our own. We always need a judgment by an established international body, and hopefully the Uyghur Tribunal will give clarity on this. Like the role of the World Uyghur Congress is strictly to provide information, so the Uyghur Tribunal is strictly independent from any civil society organization. So we think that these kind of efforts are really important to also convince the international community that what is happening is indeed a genocide, which is of course the first step, because after that what is needed is the appropriate action. And as you say, over the past year and a half, there's been a lot of public awareness for the Uyghur cause, and therefore we feel that people know what is happening right now. The world can no longer look away. What is needed now is meaningful, concrete action by the international community to really put an end to these horrific crimes against Uyghurs. Because the international community, there's enough they can do, but so far we've seen statements, we've seen public condemnation, but it has really stopped short of concrete action in a lot of cases.
It's been fairly widely reported about the forced labour, the detainments, the sterilizations. One thing I haven't heard that widely reported, but I have heard mention of, and I'd be interested to know if you've heard about it happening on the ground, is I know that when the Independent Tribunal into Forced Organ Harvesting from Prisoners of Conscience in China gave their final report, they mostly focused on religious prisoners, particularly the Falun Gong, but also Buddhist prisoners. But in that, they did say that they thought that there had been a mass DNA sampling of the Uyghur population in camps, and that a number of Uyghurs had likely been harvested for their organs. Have you seen any evidence of that, or have you heard anything about that coming from people on the ground?
The systematic organ harvesting of Uyghurs is something that is incredibly hard to see if it is actually happening in East Turkestan. As you say, there is indeed, as part of the very pervasive surveillance state in the Uyghur region now, since 2017, there has been like widespread DNA sampling. There is like CCTV cameras everywhere that register every movement of every Uyghur in the Uyghur region. And as the tribunal said, this could facilitate widespread organ harvesting of Uyghurs, but it has been incredibly difficult to verify if this is also actually happening, because it's nearly impossible to get an independent insight in what is actually happening inside these camps.
Speaking of surveillance cameras, which you mentioned there, I do remember the story a couple of months ago now, I think, on the development within China of surveillance camera that was capable of noting facial features that were common to the Uyghur population, and then there was the counterclaim that this had only been proposed and it was a thought experiment and it had never actually been developed. But then there did also seem to be other reports that said that it had been developed and it had been adopted in certain regions. Could you shed any light on it? What is the status of that technology? Is it actually on the ground?
Whether it is actually on the ground, of course, is very difficult to say. But the reports that you mentioned that have been coming out over the past month clearly indicate that tech giants like Huawei, but also Alibaba, have been involved in like offering software that could be used to single out Uyghurs from a group of people. After which, for instance, the police could be notified, Uyghurs could be arrested, detained, and subsequent actions taken. But this is indeed the involvement of such tech giants gives a pretty clear insight into the scale and the severity of the repression against Uyghurs, and also the fact that Uyghurs specifically are targeted. In this sense, it is that like being Uyghur is already reason enough to be sent to one of these internment camps. And even though outside of the Uyghur region, this system might also now be developed, but inside the Uyghur region, it's nearly impossible for Uyghurs to go out on the street without being followed or without being recognized by surveillance cameras. So this has really become a police state in which Uyghurs are not free to move and are really tracked, as you said, by the DNA sampling and those kind of things.
So it seems to be there's a constant thread of how difficult it is to actually confirm information from the region. On the information that you have actually been able to confirm, how have you guys been able to confirm it? Is it with interviews from people who've been able to get out of the camps, or is it some of the reports like Zen's or the Associated Press's report in the region? How have you gone about that and making sure that the information you have is accurate and is up to date as can be, I suppose?
Yeah, of course, these are very, very legitimate concerns. But especially over the past 2 years, there has been a huge amount of evidence coming out of the region. First of all, as you say, from camp survivors of other Uyghurs who've managed to flee the region, and they've all told their stories, and all these stories like show a lot of similarities. They all detail the sheer extent of the internment camp system, the widespread use of forced labor in the region, and also, for instance, the scheme of sterilization. Like there have been multiple Uyghur women who have fled the Uyghur region, and after that they were medically examined abroad, where it was indeed found they were forcibly sterilized. And apart from Uyghurs themselves who have managed to flee the region, as I said, there's a lot of satellite imagery that is freely accessible, and which details quite thoroughly the expansion of these camps. And then thirdly, there's also over the past few years there have been multiple leaked government documents from the Chinese Communist Party. So only 2 months ago, Human Rights Watch got insight in what was called the Axel list, which detailed very finely for what sorts of behavior Uyghurs could be sent to camps. And this included everyday, non-violent, very normal behavior. For instance, being born after 1980 was listed as one of the reasons of being suspicious to government authorities. So all in all, I think there's evidence enough to show what is actually happening there. The only thing that is, of course, missing is like independent investigation, for instance, by the United Nations or the European Union, to really look into these camps in a very independent manner, like without it being staged by the Chinese government. But based on what has been coming out as evidence over the past years, it is undeniable to say that what is actually happening is it's a widespread system of internment, forced labor, and also forced sterilizations.
So we do have some kind of stats provisional, mostly based on Chinese government documents and some of the reports we've seen on the ground. But with something like this, the stats can kind of overshadow the human nature of it. So in your work, have there been any particular personal stories you've come across of people who have been in the camps or things of that nature that you think could be important to put out there, just so that people get a sense of the actual human cost of this, that it isn't just this bloodless thing happening halfway around the world that is just numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. Like behind these very large and very outrageous numbers that you often hear, behind every single of them, there's a personal story. So in my work, basically every Uyghur that I've spoken to has one of these stories of personal loss, of personal suffering. For instance, the president of the World Uyghur Congress, Mr. Dolkun Issa, his mother died in an internment camp in 2018. And just a few months later, he had gotten news that his father also passed away under very mysterious circumstances. But he only found this out through a CCP propaganda video. So the CCP forced his sister and other family members to denounce him publicly. And through this video, he was notified that his father had also passed away. So basically, every member of the Uyghur diaspora has such a story of suffering, of loss, of family members or loved ones who have been missing. So many Uyghurs have not been able to speak to their families for years now. So there have been countless personal stories, and more personal stories are coming out as well. Uyghurs are speaking out, speaking up, even though the Chinese government continues to harass, intimidate, and threat them, no matter where they live. But these stories are very common. Yeah, basically every Uyghur knows someone who's missing or has someone missing.
You were saying earlier about people who had relatives who had simply disappeared. I've started to see more reports and stories on that in the last couple of months. And is it becoming more common for people to just be lifted and totally disappear? Or is it that Uyghurs living abroad are becoming more willing to publicly talk about it? Or is it just that it's getting picked up more, that there's more of an interest in it and it's just more of a story?
I would say it's the last point that you make. These stories have been there since the very start. Uyghurs have always like from the very close community. Uyghurs have always been speaking out, even though the Chinese government, as I said, is trying to prevent Uyghurs from speaking out by harassing them. For instance, many Uyghurs who have spoken out, who are living abroad, have been contacted by Chinese police or authorities, who then threatened their family members in the Uyghur region to be locked up, to be detained. So the Chinese government has, through like a wide range of efforts, tried to silence Uyghurs abroad. But now that like the situation is really catching the attention of the international press, these stories are coming out more and more, and also getting the attention they deserve, really.
So I want to go on to kind of the solutions and the kind of movements we're seeing on the countries. But just before we touch on that, we were talking about how the Chinese response to this has evolved over time, from denial to no, they're actually work education camps. And I imagine you've seen this, the start of this month, the Chinese embassy in the US sent out a tweet about this, where they were saying they linked to a study and said that the minds of Uyghur women in Xinjiang have been emancipated, gender equality and reproductive health has been promoted. They are no longer baby-making machines, they're confident and independent. And that seems to be an evolution of their defense into something that is very, very specific to Western cultures and a very sort of feminist undertaking. And I think for the public, if you haven't seen the reports that are talking about forcible sterilization, then that might be compelling. Of course, if you have seen the reports, for someone to come out and say they've been emancipated because they don't have to have children becomes a bit grotesque when you're aware of the mass sterilizations. But how do you think do you think this is part of a trend that we're going to see the Chinese government changing how they put forward what's happening in these camps, that they're going to be trying to make them, instead of denying their existence, they're just going to focus on saying this is allowing people to integrate and that these are positive things as opposed to a total denial of their existence?
I would say that this rhetoric that you mentioned here is something we've seen for basically since the whole issue started. Like, for instance, the counterterrorism measures were like adopted after 9/11, after like the US adopted the rhetoric of the war on terror. So the Chinese government, in its propaganda, in its disinformation, has always been very quick to adopt the terminology that is also popular in the West. As I said, like the internment camps, China has defended them by saying, "Oh, these are re-education camps. We are re-educating Uyghurs and like transforming them into citizens with hope for a good job, for a better, a healthier future." But this doesn't add up when you think, or when you see that like these detainees Uyghurs are also very well educated people, like being professors and so on. So I would say that the rhetoric that China has been adopting is, of course, constantly evolving according to what is relevant or what would be seen as more or less accepted in the West. But it is something that has been done consistently, to not only towards, of course, Western people in the West, but also to its own citizens. Of course, we here in the West, we have something called freedom of press. So there is like we are able to access not only the Chinese propaganda but also the counter stories. And whereas in China itself, like the Chinese people, they only hear from what the government tells them. So this is not only targeting the people in the West, this type of propaganda, but I would also say the Chinese citizens itself.
So onto the actual solutions and what can be done about this. I suppose the first question is can something be done about this by people outside China? Because I know I certainly had conversations with people, including politicians, where the general tone is that, you know, it's halfway across the world and they don't care what we do about it. I mean, they're a massive country, they're immensely wealthy, they're just going to do what they want, which seems a bit defeatist, I mean, right off the bat. So, and is there something that people outside China, countries outside China, can do to help here?
Absolutely, there are many things governments can do, but also companies, businesses, even consumers, people themselves. And I would say, even though China is a big country, its economic power and political power now is also immense. But it doesn't mean that China is not susceptible to pressure from the outside. One of the other phases of Chinese propaganda is that it also shows that the Chinese government does care what, for instance, Europe or the US thinks about them. We have seen it now with the recent agreement, the comprehensive agreement on investment between EU and China. China has been pushing incredibly hard to finalize an investment agreement, this investment agreement with Europe, before the end of 2020. Not necessarily, I think, because of its economic consequences for China, but because of its political, the political message that it sends. Because, for instance, concluding this agreement with Europe now sends a message also to the US that China, despite its grave human rights abuses that have been deteriorating over the past year, it is still freely able to enter into these agreements with the European Union. And this is also a point of action for not only European Union, but I think for the international community in general. One of the main one is that the international community should not do business with a government that we consider is committing a genocide. And this is not only governments can do something about. For instance, governments could really hold their own companies accountable for doing business in East Turkestan. As I've said, it is safe to say that the entire apparel, like all the cotton that originates in East Turkestan, is tainted by Uyghur forced labor. So there is no excuse for both governments or for companies to do nothing about this. As I said, governments can introduce legislation that makes it mandatory for companies to pursue proper what they call due diligence. So to make sure, in this case, that they do not have any business relationships with factories or companies in East Turkestan. Companies themselves can act on this. They can leave the region. They can ensure they receive their cotton from other regions in the world. And also, as a consumer, in the case of forced labor, you can write these companies. You can start buying clothes from sustainable brands who do not source their cotton from East Turkestan. So through all levels of society, there's plenty of possibility to really act. So that absolutely, there's a lot of possibilities.
So let's say I'm a consumer and I want to try and buy ethical products. I want to buy products that aren't tainted by forced labor. Is there anywhere online? I mean, is there a website or anything I can go onto and I can see the companies that are involved in this or that are profiting from this in kind of one place?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, there are multiple, I would say, labels that really indicate where good cotton comes from. For instance, and this is something that also for consumers is very interesting to follow. The World Uyghur Congress is part of a coalition of over 300 other civil society organizations called the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur Region. And this coalition has come out with a call to action, writing to companies to analyze their supply chains, and if it is found that cotton from East Turkestan is indeed used, this call to action means if these companies sign this call to action, it means that they are working actively to move out of the region. So this is something consumers can follow. Like they can see which companies, which brands have signed this call to action, which brands speak out publicly on the Uyghur issue. And then there are as I said, like very like various labels that indicate if, for instance, cotton is grown without the use of forced labor. So there are many of such labels that consumers can look at.
Have you guys done any work on the sort of outreach that China is doing, sort of prestige building, not at national level, but at local level, kind of promoting friendship agreements with local governments, twinning arrangements, all of that sort of stuff? I know myself, one of the county councils in Ireland, Cork, they had a friendship agreement with a province, and I went to them and said, "Okay, here are some reports saying that there's forced labor in this province, and are you happy to remain associated with that? Because by being associated with it, you're giving somewhat of a shield to it because you're happy to lend your name to it." And the response I got from them was that we are aware that there are differences in values between our two countries, which if someone goes to you and says there's forced labor, effectively slave labor in part, and you say, well, there are differences in values, it seems you may have somewhere of an upward climb to convince governments to get on board with this.
Yes, absolutely. I think, as I said, like through the Belt and Road Initiative, I think it's one of the main projects through which China is expanding its not only its economy but also its values, its repressive regime, its authoritarianism abroad to other countries. And this is also like an opportunity also for the international community to really be aware of that this is happening, and that to not let China do this without repercussions. Like the European or like the international community also has the opportunity to, on its own, to make sure that it promotes human rights, democracy abroad, because we've seen too much silence and too much inaction on behalf of the international community to tackle China's expanding authoritarianism, even in Europe. For instance, China has sold some of its very repressive surveillance technology to Serbia. The Serbian army has had joint drills with the Chinese army, and this is happening in the backyard of the European Union. So I think, yeah, as you say, like awareness is the very first step, but it also needs to be followed up with specific action, and yeah, also more awareness raising in other countries.
I mean, from your position as the EU policy coordinator, how has the response been amongst European nations to your work? Is there a general willingness to work with you on this, or is there more of a concern that any sort of pushback on this will anger the Chinese and might have economic consequences, as we're sort of seeing Australia take right now?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, of course, the European Union is in itself a very complex system, in the sense that it is not only a single entity, but it is also made up of various individual states. But absolutely, the European Union itself, but also the European member states have showed willingness to listen to us. Like we're always like able to have our say, and we're able to meet with persons. But from meeting with them, from being heard, to from there leading to actual action to be taken, that is a different step. As you say, many countries, not only in Europe but also outside of Europe, are sometimes very reluctant to really enact like very concrete measures because of China's economic power, which we cannot deny is of course very important to also to Europe. Like the example again of the EU-China investment agreement shows that for the European Union, but also for its member states, economic considerations are very highly thought of, and in this case, like you could say, it trumps human rights, and it's putting profit over like actual human lives in East Turkestan, because as I said, like it's time for action. Like it's like business as usual cannot continue, and China is susceptible to also like economic pressure, of course, because it needs its experts, it needs the European market. So if Europe and European countries jointly take a stance and say we will not do business, we will not sign any trade deals whatsoever with you unless you commit to respecting your human rights obligations, you actually do respect your human rights obligations, not only commit them, but actually respect them. If you make a firm stance and like really make your economic trade relations with China conditional on China respecting its human rights obligations, that can make a real difference. But it's agreed, it's incredibly difficult to get all EU member states behind that, and also the European Union as such, because of China's economic but also political power.
I suppose, Koen, just to close with, on something like this, do you have any concern that as more attention is focused on this and international opposition to it grows, that rather than stop China, it will push China to accelerate the process somehow, or to become more draconian, rather than actually causing them to stop the current approach? Is that a concern at all, or?
I think there's a difference between like the more public attention it gets, the more people speak out on it. This could indeed be a concern from China as well, in the sense that it might speed up the process. And that is also why it is necessary now to take action. Like you cannot afford to wait any longer, because what we've seen over the past year, like China implementing a scheme to suppress Uyghur birth rates by sterilizing Uyghur women, it shows that China is not only like indoctrinating Uyghurs by like changing their minds and like really eradicating the culture, but it's eradicating a people in itself. So this indeed shows that China it doesn't stop with forced labor or detention. Like China is deliberately eradicating a people, and that's why like voicing your concerns, like for instance, if the international community voices concerns in its bilateral talks with China, we've seen over the past few years that China, like they listen, like, but they don't do anything. They don't care about what they say. Like only real action will really be able to put an end to this. So yeah, absolutely, it is a concern that like China's policies are becoming more and more concerning to us, and that's why we keep reiterating our calls that real and substantial action needs to be taken really soon.
Koen Stoop of the World Uyghur Congress, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Gary.